On the last episode of Power Metal Point, we touched on the first 20 years of Metallica's career. Now it's time to look at the most hotly debated and contested era, one which has confused and frustrated most fans, the past decade. If you haven't watched part 1, I would recommend that you do that, especially for newer fans of Metallica. If you've been following the band for years, I'm sure you'll be fine starting here. Following the S&M CD release, Metallica remained high profile throughout the next year, first by releasing a song on the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack, I Disappear. When Lars discovered an unfinished demo of the song on Napster, well before the final mixes of the song were completed, he was understandably upset. Everyone over the age of 20 already knows where this is going. I'm going to talk a lot more about the Napster trial and its effect on the music industry in a later video, but for now, here's the short version. By the year 2000, Napster was the first major online MP3 sharing software, which had exploded in popularity. When Lars discovered I Disappear, he also found out that all of their music was freely and illegally available. Legal action was taken against Napster to have their music removed. The lawsuit alleged that 3 different types of copyright infringement had taken place, and they delivered the names of hundreds of thousands of users who had downloaded their music to the California District Court. Metallica and Dr. Dre got in on the action. A district court demanded Napster install filters removing bands that wished to be removed at once or be forced to shut down its servers forever. Contrary to popular belief, Lars nor Metallica actually sued any individual users, although the Recording Industry Association of America did in fact sue several users for hundreds of thousands of dollars due to copyright infringement. Despite this fact, Lars was seen as a poster boy for crusading artists of their rights, which cost Metallica a lot of their credibility, with many fans perceiving them as rich businessmen who had sold out in order to keep making money. Lars took a lot of negative publicity during this time, and it would tarnish his reputation for the next several years. Much of the mean spirit toward Lars at that time was probably unwarranted, and regardless of how anyone feels about music sharing, the fact remains that at some level you are taking the work of another without any sort of royalty or payment. Now, can we all agree on this very basic principle? This has nothing to do with ideology or how you feel about it. At some level, there is something being taken, regardless of whether it is a physical or digital copy of something. For an excellent take on piracy, especially in regards to the video game industry, check out Extra Credits' episode on piracy, which you can easily find through Google. While the Napster court battle was continuing, Jason was writing and recording with a new alternative band called Echo Brain. This enabled him to have a greater creative input and a change in style. Metallica wasn't happy with Jason playing with a second band, arguing that it detracted from Metallica's image and would require juggling their schedule. Jason argued that James's involvement with providing guest vocals for Danzig and the South Park movie as well as other projects didn't hurt Metallica's ability to tour or their image. After 15 years with the band, Jason had had enough and quit the band in January 2001. To make matters worse, around this time, James Hetfield entered rehab for 10 months. The band was put on hiatus, and Lars and Kirk were left to wonder if Metallica was done for good. When James was finally sober, he rejoined Metallica under new terms. The band would work under stricter hours so he could spend more time with his family, and they would have an in-house psychiatrist to help heal fractured relationships. Some Kind of Monster provides an interesting perspective on this period of the band, and I would recommend checking it out to get a greater insight into this time of Metallica. Metallica would use the next year to write and record their first original album in 6 years, Saint Anger. With the departed Newsted, Metallica asked producer and former Paola's bassist Bob Rock to record the bass lines. For Saint Anger, Metallica departed from their usual methods of songwriting, which consisted of James mostly writing the music privately and then Lars adding the lyrics. Instead, Bob recommended that they try jamming and then recording together at the same time in the studio. This, along with down-tuned guitars and the obvious influence of the metal movement sweeping America at the time called nu metal, which featured down-tuned guitars, few guitar solos, and rap vocals, all made Saint Anger a very controversial album. James was out of key in places. The guitar tone was raw, the snare drum sounded like a tin can, and in my opinion sounded like utter shite. In short, the album sounded like it was recorded by an inexperienced garage band who was in their late teens and spent their time listening to Korn, not the guys who wrote Master of Puppets and not the producer who was responsible for one of the best-sounding albums of all time. Metallica was clearly having an identity crisis. No longer in their 20s, no longer pissed off at the world with something to prove, they wrote a heavy album because they had to write a heavy album. I'm sure if those expectations were not in place, James would have been just as happy writing some Amy Winehouse music or something along the lines of The Smiths. Lyrically, much of the album deals with James trying to purge his demons after years of alcohol abuse stemming from his estrangement from his father and the loss of his mother, who was a Christian Scientist who died of cancer, partly because she strongly disapproved of modern medicine, instead opting for her faith to heal her. Ultimately, Saint Anger is not an album most fans look favorably upon, including myself. There are a few pretty good songs on there, including Some Kind of Monster, which actually sounded pretty decent when it was remixed, and the snare drum sound was drastically altered for a more traditional snare sound. I think the most difficult aspect to take in, even more than the production and lyrics, is the total absence of guitar solos. Since the beginning, Metallica has always been known for memorable solos, which have been learned by thousands of metal guitarists. Not hearing solos, at least for me, meant Metallica was falling exactly in line with what the industry wanted and what nu metal was doing. They seem to have sidestepped their roots completely. Because of the dark place Metallica was in for the last couple of years, this seemed to be an album they desperately needed to get out of their systems. They could now begin the hunt for a new bassist and start anew. In 2003, the band settled on former Ozzy and Suicidal Tendencies bassist Rob Trujillo. They would headline the Summer Sanitarium tour, which featured bands such as Linkin Park and Limp Bizkit. At least with Saint Anger, Metallica didn't seem horribly out of place with such a lineup of bands. Part of the purging process included a separation from longtime producer Bob Rock. Fans, already upset with the Saint Anger album, took to an online petition asking Metallica to dismiss Bob Rock from the producer's chair. I doubt the petition ever impacted their decision, but the band soon hired Slayer and Red Hot Chili Peppers producer Rick Rubin soon after, hoping he could help them to recapture their former glory in the studio. Another sign that Metallica was embracing their past and that fans needn't worry about suffering through another Saint Anger was that they began playing the Master of Puppets album live in its entirety. Likewise, Rubin asked the band when writing new songs to try and get back into their frame of mind when they recorded that album. Rubin was basically saying, Puppets is your most beloved album. We need to recapture that energy and style again. You guys need to write an album that proves why you're one of the most influential bands ever. In September of 2008, Metallica fans were given their wish. Metallica returned to their roots with the release of Death Magnetic. The songs again feature guitar solos. The production brought to mind a bygone era. Metallica was once again angry, but it was focused and with impressive musical and songwriting chops to boot. Most fans were ecstatic with the initial samples they heard of the music, only to discover that when they put in their CD, the music was insanely compressed and distorted. Critics and audio enthusiasts alike noted the bad sound and were disappointed because the music itself was what we'd all been waiting years to hear. When the Guitar Hero versions of the album were released, fans immediately noted how much better and non-distorted they sounded. Mastering engineer Ted Jensen stated on his blog that the mixes were already brick-walled when they were given to him. See, in the studio, bands will record all of their parts and then have the album mixed, which involves having all of the audio levels balanced so the song as a whole gels without certain parts being too quiet or others being too loud and overpowering each other, as well as effects added. When the mixes are finalized, they're usually sent to someone else to be mastered, which involves taking all of the songs and making sure the EQ, or treble and bass between songs, is relatively consistent so that the album works as a whole. Then the volume of each song is raised and lowered so that the album is a consistent volume. However, the audio sent to Ted Jensen was already heavily distorted, and there was little he could do to salvage the audio. You can't undistort a distorted signal. Fans petitioned Metallica to remix and remaster the album to give it its proper audio fidelity, although it seems we'll never get to hear Death Magnetic as it properly sounds through a proper release by the band. And now it's time to talk about the album that has everyone either pissed off or just completely ignored altogether, Lulu. In 2009, Metallica played with Lou Reed at the 25th anniversary Rock and Roll Hall of Fame concert. They discussed the idea of doing an album together, and in 2010, Lou Reed had a concept called Lulu. It was originally to be a two-play theatrical rendition of German expressionist playwright Frank Wedekind, with Metallica contributing heavily to the songwriting and arranging the song ideas Lou Reed had. In the early summer, we were teased with quotes about the album being Master of Puppets meets Lou Reed's Berlin, an ambitious merging of these two diametrically opposed artists. I don't know about you, but I feel lied to. There is very little on Lulu that comes close to being as good as anything found on Master of Puppets. Before I get into this next part, I'm going to recommend that you take a listen to a Lulu song called The View, so you'll have an idea of what I'm talking about. As far as I know, this was also the unofficial single released from the album and the first song I heard from it. Lyrically, Lulu is actually somewhat interesting. Go read the lyrics if you have a chance. There's surely something of value to be read. At very least, you'll learn something about German Expressionism. However, for this metal fan, that's where it stops being interesting or fun. On all of the songs, we have Lou Reed half reading and half singing lyrics over repeated banal metal riffs. Then we get treated to 45 seconds of Metallica with James singing. Here's the Metallica part of the album. And then it's back to Lou Reed reciting more poetry. While this project is completely off the wall from anything in Metallica's career, I don't feel the uniqueness of it equates to quality. As Chuck Klosterman says, Lulu was not written for people who enjoy music. It was recorded to be discussed, dissected, and was created purely for Lou and Metallica. This album is almost a hipster's dream come true. The irony of Metallica trying to sound hip or artistic while playing the music that was never hip to begin with, heavy metal, played with the hipster demigod Lou Reed and turning out completely terrible is, to some hipsters, incredibly ironic, except that it's 15 years too late to be ironic. Metallica fans have gone through disappointments before, and when we heard about this project, most of us felt it was either going to be decent or royally suck. Lou Reed isn't exactly known as an influence to anybody who's a serious metal fan, despite having recorded a totally unmetal album called Heavy Metal Machine in the early 1970s. Sadly, Lulu fits squarely into the suck category, and meeting expectations is not ironic. The only ironic thing about this album is that 25 years ago, Metallica would have needed a serious brain injury to have ever gotten this project past the demo stage. Not today. Ever since the Black Album made Metallica huge stars, the band has decided to run things their own way. If we want to make an alternative album, we're going to. And if the label won't release it, we'll find someone who will be happy to do so. An all-covers album? You bet your ass. Symphony concert? We're one of the biggest bands in the world. If we want to do it, who are you to stop us? Metallica wanted to create an art rock album just for their sake, just to see what would happen. Even statements from the band about the album seem to indicate they don't care about it doing well commercially, or even if anyone likes it. They wanted to do this. And if they can get even a single fan of theirs to appreciate German Expressionism or Lou Reed, to them, it's all the better. I think Metallica's output of the last 15 years or so can be summed up as this. Metallica got too old, too rich, and too married. Without the grindstone of the recording industry, MTV, radio, and their management demanding that they stay the course, they let their imaginations run wild. And while this may be good for high art, it was not good for their brand of heavy metal. Art thrives in its limitations and expectations, and because of Metallica's independence and financial security, they had no one's expectations to meet but their own. This is a byproduct of the internet age where no one buys albums. Without the grand expectation of having to sell 4 million albums, Metallica were given the freedom to do whatever they pleased because no one was going to buy the album, whether it was good as Master of Puppets or not. I know that last little bit was a bit harsh towards Lulu, and I know it wasn't explicitly a Metallica album. It featured a lot of stuff by Lou Reed, who admittedly I'm not a fan of. I'll be right up front with that. But I've got to say, having the stamp on it that says Metallica was a part of this, I think I was expecting a little bit better. Okay, so now that we have Metallica's history as a context for the band, what can we expect from Metallica in the future? Regardless of the original material that they put out in the next couple of years, they're still a very good live band. They put on a great show with setlists loaded from tunes from their first 5 albums. For guys in their early 50s, they can still kick some serious ass on stage. They seem to have finally embraced their roots and where they've come from, especially given that they've brought back nearly every musician who's ever been associated with Metallica in their history at the 30th anniversary shows. Seriously, how cool was it to see friggin' Lloyd Grant play with Metallica? I'm not entirely keen on the guitar solo he laid down in the original version, Hit the Lights, but I mean, come on, the guy played on one demo with them and probably only graced Metallica's presence for an hour or two. Now that's devotion to your fans if I've ever seen it. So, if we can just forget Lulu and think of it more as a Lou Reed album, just happen to have Metallica guest on it, I suppose it's pretty safe to say at this point that Metallica is stepping into the right direction, and certainly Death Magnetic was a step in the right direction. It seems Metallica is again ready to give the metal militia a bit of whiplash with some new music. Let's just hope whatever they record, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb when it gets played after Creeping Death on your iPod.